Hey there, welcome into Unpaid Interns. It is Friday afternoon, January 22nd, and to close out our week, we have another great guest to talk college basketball today. Jack Grossman joins me again here on Unpaid Interns. He works at ESPN Louisville, former IU grad, and just the biggest college basketball fan, probably out of John Rothstein. I was thinking, I'm not sure there's anyone out of John Rothstein that watches more college basketball than you do, Jack.
I try. I mean, I love it. These are my 2-3 months of the year that, yes, the weather is crappy. Yes, it's cold, but the days are short. But I love it just because we got basketball on basically every single day leading up to March Madness and actually an NCAA tournament this year. So, yes, I'm excited. I'm happy. And it's a great time of year for me.
As John Rothstein says, you sleep in April, sleep in May, and you stay up all night watching college basketball. And it works with the weather now. You don't want to go outside. So you got to stay inside. You got to do something. So it definitely works with the calendar for certain. I got to start, though, with last night, Jack. Don't want to make this an Indiana basketball podcast today, but one of the biggest upsets in college basketball probably all this season. Indiana went on the road and shocked number 4 Iowa. I want to get your thoughts first, but my follow-up to it, or a two-part question, I guess, is this. We've seen these big wins before, maybe not this surprising of a win in the Archie Miller era, but we haven't been able to see them back it up and consistently perform like that. How do they do that going forward?
It's a great question. They got to be consistent, obviously. They need consistency. That's been the thing that's kind of gone away during the Archie Miller era. Just hasn't been a thing. I mean, you brought up the fact they haven't followed up big wins with good performances. Last year, they beat Iowa, who's a top 15 team at the time. Not as good as they are this year, but still a really, really solid team. And it was coming off a 4-game losing streak. It was really the low point of the year for IU. But you feel like, okay, they beat Iowa at home by double digits. Maybe they've figured things out. Then they go on the road to Michigan and lose by 24. So, I mean, it's obviously sometimes you just haven't been able to follow up those big wins with good performances off of that. I mean, earlier this year, they come off the Providence game, get blown out by Texas. They get a solid win over Stanford, then lose to Florida State. 2 years ago, they go and beat Michigan State, a top 5 team on the road. Probably, other than last night, the best win of the Archie Miller era. And then they follow that up by losing to a really, really crappy Northwestern team the game after that. So, I mean, they just haven't been able to do it. They need to be able to be consistent. Obviously, on the offensive end, and they got to keep hitting shots as they finally were able to do. Last night, the million-dollar question is, was it Indiana's offense or Iowa's defense that led to them being able to score the ball a lot more effectively? I don't know. I mean, as usual, I'd say it's probably both, as usually a good litmus test on that. But Indiana's got to be able to put up similar offensive production, be able to hit open shots in the same way when they're playing better defenses than what Iowa has. And also on the defensive end, they played probably their best 20, 25 minutes of basketball on the defensive end. Obviously, yes, it helps that C.J. Frederick was out in the second half. It allowed Indiana to kind of redo everything that they were doing defensively, double Luka Garza a lot more, make life a lot more difficult for him. But Indiana still played really good defense in the last 8, 10, 12 minutes of the first half. Also, Iowa scored on 10 of their first 15 possessions of the game, scoring 67% of the time. The rest of the game, they only scored 22 of their next 51 possessions. So Indiana obviously doing very, very good work on the defensive end. Only 6 of their last 15 trips in the first half. So even before TJ Frederick went out, you saw Indiana turn up the intensity on the defensive end, do a much better job of taking away open three-point shots, harassing Luka Garza, making life a lot more difficult for him. And that's something that when you look at maybe the offensive things aren't going to translate and become long-term fixes, but defensively, if you can do that for 20, 25 minutes against that Iowa team who is the top-rated team in KenPom's adjusted offensive efficiency, that says, okay, the next goal needs to be, can you do that on a consistent basis? Not 100% of the time, but 70, 75% of the time to give you a chance in every game you play in.
It was a remarkable defensive performance by the Hoosiers. Do want to turn it to college basketball at large, and the biggest storyline I think this season in college basketball has been the struggles of the Blue Bloods, maybe most notably Kentucky, Duke, and North Carolina. None of them currently ranked in the top 25. Why has that happened, do you think, Jack? And is it good for college basketball that you have some of the powerhouses struggling and maybe giving opportunities to other programs? Or do I guess blue bloods at their best make college basketball a better sport?
Yes and no, because obviously when Kentucky and Duke and Carolina and even a UCLA, I almost said Kansas. But Kansas is fine. They're not what they normally are, but they're still like a top 15, top 20 team. That's what's going to draw the viewership, because obviously the two things that drive college basketball viewership, which it is down, it is always down, is they want to see the top NBA prospects and they want to see the blue bloods. Those are the two things that drive college basketball ratings. So when Kentucky is bad and Carolina is bad and Duke is bad, that's going to hurt college basketball's ratings, because yes, Gonzaga is incredible. Yes, Baylor's incredible. Yes, Texas is really damn good. Yes, Michigan and Iowa are really, really good. But the average sports fan on a national landscape, when they see Baylor and Texas, it's just not going to have the same cachet as a top 5 matchup between Duke and North Carolina, or North Carolina, Kentucky. It's just not going to. And that's part of the issue that the sport is facing right now, is how do you try to get more viewers into the sport, not to just watch those few blue bloods, because when those blue bloods do struggle, you are going to lose ratings. However, I mean, from a college basketball fan standpoint, if you're going to watch the sport no matter who's good, it's really fun to see Gonzaga and Baylor be spectacular. It's really fun to see Shaka Smart get things rolling at Texas, to see Michigan go on the run that they've had to start the year. They got a big game against Purdue tonight. Now, to see different teams get up, but it does hurt I would think it would hurt the ratings. Now, as far as what's wrong with the teams, I mean, there's a consistent trend with especially the three big ones, Duke, Carolina, and Kentucky. They're all young, and when you're in a year like this with the pandemic, you don't have all of the time, all the resources that you would normally have to start a year. Yes, obviously everyone's dealing with COVID, everyone's dealing with the pandemic, but you don't have as much time to get everyone to mesh together like you normally would in a year. And plus you don't have the cupcake games that you normally have to try to. So like Kentucky and Calipari, they will play the Champions Classic, and then in December, they'll play the CBS Sports Classic. They'll probably play one more big neutral site game. They'll play Louisville. But in between the Champions Classic and those 3-4 games, other big non-conference tilts, they generally play 6-7 cupcake games. And that's where Calipari a lot of times figures out his team, figures out his roster, and that team builds chemistry. I'm not saying that's the only reason Kentucky sucks this year. Obviously, it's not. Calipari missed on multiple fronts on the recruiting process. BJ Boston isn't nearly as good as people thought he would be. Terrence Clark, before he got hurt, hasn't been very good. Olivier Starr was a major bust, the Wake Forest grad transfer. So obviously that has a lot more to do with it. But when you look at the consistent trend between those three schools being so young, Carolina, yes, has a more experienced front court, but they're still relying on freshman guards in the backcourt. And Duke just doesn't have the same talent level that they normally have. There's no Zion Williamson on this team. There's no Marvin Bagley on this team. There's no Jason Tatum. I mean, Matthew Hurt's pretty good. Jalen Johnson finally had a breakout game earlier in the week, but it's just not the same type of high-level talent. So I would say that's probably number one, that there's just not as much talent on those teams as there usually are. And number two, COVID taking away a lot of the schedule of what they do with the early non-conference season has hurt them as well. They're just not as talented as they normally are. There's no way to get around it.
Now, the two most talented teams in the country, at least by record and how they played on the court, have been Gonzaga and Baylor. You mentioned both of them, both undefeated. Neither's really been that closely tested so far this season. Are they far and away the favorites right now to make it to the Final Four and one of the two win the national championship in March?
I was almost ready to throw Michigan into that group after they thumped Wisconsin about a week ago, but then they go and laid an egg at Minnesota. I get it. Eli Brooks didn't play in that game. However, Michigan's a team that in all their wins, they only have, I think, one or two by single digits. They're just busting people also. So I think they still have the potential to join that group. Obviously, Iowa, a lot of people wanted to throw in there also. They took a big hit by losing to Indiana last night. And they've had a couple just really questionable defensive performances. Villanova's a team that's 9-1, but just is coming off a really long COVID pause, I think, could crack that. And Texas has been really damn good, too, even though they lost on a Great comeback by Texas Tech. Matt McClung hit a game winner with a couple seconds left last week. I think those are the other teams that could potentially join. But right now, yes, there is a clear gap between Gonzaga, Baylor, and everyone else. Because Gonzaga went out and they just busted people in the non-conference. They busted Kansas. They beat Iowa by 11, and it wasn't even that close. They destroyed Auburn. They had the game with Baylor, unfortunately postponed due to COVID, but they're a team that I would say is probably the best chance since IU went undefeated in 76. They might have the best chance of pulling off an undefeated season and a national title because they've already gotten through the challenging part of their schedule. They're in the West Coast Conference, which is, better than what has been in the past, but there's still no one there that's going to challenge Gonzaga. I mean, they were down 14 to St. Mary's late in the first half over the weekend. They still end up pulling away and winning by double digits really easily. I mean, there's just no one there that's going to beat Gonzaga that can hang with them for 40 minutes. So I think it's not really even a question that they're going to enter the NCAA tournament undefeated. It's can they finish it off and run through the table and win the championship? And right now, they're the favorite to do that. I mean, they got so much talent with Jalen Suggs, Andrew Nemhard, Corey Kispert, Drew Timme. Now, you have Joel Ayayi being probably one of the best 30, 40 players in the sport, and he's like your fourth or fifth option offensively. It's just unfair how good they are on the offensive end, and it's so incredibly fun to watch. And then Baylor, I think, is the only team that could probably beat Gonzaga because they're so incredibly good defensively, and they can score on top of it to keep pace on the other end. The way Maceo Teague, Davion Mitchell, Gerard Butler are able to defend and disrupt anyone and everyone on the perimeter is really the thing that I said, okay, maybe they could hang with Gonzaga. And you have Mark Vidal on the inside to deal with Timme. I think that's the matchup that we're all waiting for right now, is whether it gets rescheduled in the regular season or happens in March Madness is what happens when Gonzaga plays Baylor. And no one knows because I think Baylor probably will not go undefeated just because the Big 12, outside the Big 10, is probably the best conference in the sport because they do have to play Texas. I don't know if they play – I think they do a full round robin in the Big 12, so they'll play Texas twice, plus if they play them again in the Big 12 tournament, if there is a Big 12 tournament. I find it really hard to believe that they'll be able to beat that Texas team 3 times. West Virginia is really good. They haven't played Kansas yet. They haven't played Cade Cunningham and Oklahoma State yet, I don't think. I'm trying to remember if they've played Texas Tech yet either. So there's some really good teams in the Big 12 that I just think at some point Baylor will have an off night and they'll play a really good team that can nip them. But they are clearly very, very clear. Oh, Baylor just beat Texas Tech. What am I saying? They just beat Texas Tech over the weekend. But those two teams have clearly separated themselves from everyone else as they are on their own level, and it is them versus the field right now.
Wanted to go over halfway through the college basketball season, if you can believe it, here at the end of January. Wanted to just kind of do a quick run through all the Power 5 conferences, give your thoughts on where they're at. Try to maybe keep it to around 2 minutes or so we can get through them all and not keep you here forever. I wanted to start with the SEC just because in the last couple of weeks, Alabama has been one of the most interesting teams in the country. They lost to Western Kentucky earlier this year. They have now won 8 in a row. They're undefeated in the SEC. They just put up 2 million points against LSU a couple nights ago. Alabama's a football school. What in the world's going on in Tuscaloosa with Nate Oates, and are they the clear favorite right now in the SEC?
Nate Oates can coach, man. He's a hell of a coach. I really liked him when he was at Buffalo, if you remember, in the NCAA Tournament a couple years ago. Everyone had Arizona as a 4 seed with DeAndre Ayton in that group in the Final Four. And Buffalo whipped them in the first round. Were able to get a big win, a big upset victory over the Wildcats. Everything they do is threes at the rim and free throws. It's basically Mike D'Antoni's Houston Rockets, except they actually pass the ball. And well, that's what it is. I mean, I saw a graphic when they were beating Kentucky. They get roughly 30% of their points from the three-point line, another 40% from layups and dunks, and then they get like 25% from free throws, only 2% from mid-range. So only 2% of their points come from 2-pointers that aren't at the rim. So, I mean, like, it is very modern basketball. It's fun. It's up-tempo. It's really exciting to watch. I don't know how the hell they lost to Stanford and in the Maui in Asheville, and then to Western Kentucky. I mean, Charles Batch, he's a beast. He's going to be a first rounder in the NBA. But I mean, like, they're not that good. I mean, they're probably an NCAA tournament team. They're not that good. But obviously, they have figured things out. They've won 8 in a row. I'd still say maybe Tennessee could be the cream of the crop also with them, but it's as I said, like it's Gonzaga, Baylor, and everyone else on the national landscape. It is Alabama, then Tennessee, then everyone else in the SEC right now. There's not much else other than those two teams in that league.
Let's go to the West Coast. I love always talking Pac-12 hoops. Doesn't get a lot of attention. Not really getting a lot of attention this year just because they only have 2 teams in the top 25. But UCLA, they're putting together quite a season right now. Just won again last night. They're 7th in a row. They're 8-0 in the Pac-12. Mick Cronin's done a great job his first couple years in Westwood. Are the Bruins potentially back long-term to being one of the best teams in college basketball?
I think it's too early to tell just because it's only year 2 for Mick Cronin. You got to give coaches time to really flesh things out. Obviously, a big jump from year 2 to year 1. I really like Mick Cronin. I think he did a really good job with Cincinnati. He kind of took the torch from Bob Huggins and kept Cincinnati nationally relevant, even though they had to go from the Big East to the American Athletic Conference. He was the class of the American at Cincinnati. So, I mean, like, I thought that was an interesting hire, but a good hire. I wonder how he'd fit at UCLA, even though I think he is a good coach. But he's been doing a really good job there. I think UCLA's probably a tournament team. Arizona, I saw one on a buzzer beater last night. Big night for the Miller family last night between Sean and Archie. But I mean, like, the Pac-12 is just kind of a great unknown. That's where it really hurts that there's not a lot of non-conference games this year. Obviously, there's more in basketball than there was in college football, but there weren't a lot of chances for the Pac-12 to really prove that they belonged to be on the same stage as a Big Ten or a Big 12 or even an SEC, just because there weren't a lot of non-conference games. And when there's not that, people just will kind of keep the stigma that they had going into the season of the Pac-12 isn't very good. Well, I don't know if the Pac-12 is good or not. It's kind of random. I mean, USC was one of the top teams in the league. They lost to Oregon State a couple nights ago. So, I mean, it's just really kind of a big question mark right now of how good the Pac-12 is, just because there's not a lot of data we have from non-conference games of them playing other conferences.
And I would argue it would help the Pac-12 as well if they didn't schedule all of their conference games either in the middle of the afternoon on weekdays or at midnight time on the East Coast.
Man, I live for Bill Walton at midnight, though.
No one up is up to watch it, or everyone's at work, though. I don't get their scheduling philosophies. I know it's a weird season, but the eyes just aren't on these games. I think UCLA just entered the top 25, which boggled my mind considering how hot they've been of late. So questions about that, but the Pac-12 certainly proving its depth with some of its teams this year. We know the Big Ten is very deep. One of the deepest conferences we've probably seen in college basketball in a long time. Iowa did just lose last night at the top. Michigan's been very good, as you mentioned it. Is Michigan kind of asserted itself as the favorite? And outside of Iowa, who is the biggest threat to the Wolverines to take the Big Ten Conference crown?
I think so. I mean, they've just been so spectacular. Obviously, the addition of Hunter Dickinson has been huge. Franz Wagner has really developed. Isaiah Livers has become a bona fide star. Mike Smith, the transfer, has been a huge addition for them. Because that was the big question, was how do you replace Xavier Simpson, the guy that had been the maestro, the guy that had carried that Michigan program for 4 years as their anchor, their point guard, and they haven't missed a beat. In fact, they've gotten even better without Xavier Simpson, which is really it's not something we expected to say. That's how well Mike Smith and Eli Brooks have taken over that kind of dual point guard role, and they fire on all cylinders. I was wrong about Juwan Howard. I did not think that was going to work, where I just wasn't sure how that was going to work. I knew he had the NBA experience, so I thought he could coach, just I didn't know if he could recruit. And what he did was he surrounded himself with a lot of guys that had college basketball coaching experience to help him recruit, get into people's houses, be able to get guys like a Hunter Dickinson, be able to get the #1 recruiting class for next season. So I'd be like, he's got it rolling there. And like, there's no doubt in my mind that he's going to be a factor as long as he's at Michigan and Ann Arbor. And as far as just who could challenge them, I don't know right now, because I mean, Iowa doesn't play defense consistently enough. Obviously, if you're losing to Indiana, you're probably not going to win the Big Ten. I'd say Wisconsin, if they didn't just get blasted by Michigan a week ago. I'd say probably those are still the two out there. Michigan State, kind of going on with the Blue Bloods with Kentucky, Carolina, Duke has been a major disappointment. I don't really know if there's anyone that can challenge them. Illinois, but they keep losing games. It's just like everyone's being cannibalized by the Big Ten except for Michigan. Michigan's been the only school that's kind of been able to be a cut above that, and there's still time for them to fall back down to the pack also. But as of now, it really is just kind of Michigan then everyone else. It's really in a league that's so good and so deep. It's kind of bizarre how it's almost a one-team race up front right now.
It's interesting. How about the ACC for a conference that has struggled this year? They have no teams currently in the top 10. And I mean, in past years, the ACC has been far away off in the best conference in college basketball. Virginia has played better of late. They're their current top-ranked team at 13. Why is the ACC struggling so much this year?
It's kind of similar to what we said about the Blue Bloods, as there's just not a lot of talent in the league. If you think about the ACC from 2 years ago, the 2018-19 year, you had Zion and that Duke team. You had Kobe White. You had obviously the Virginia team that actually won the title. And you see how much talent there was. That's the third team I'm mentioning. I mean, heck, you even had Florida State be a top 10 team. You had with Kevin Gelle, that group. You had a Louisville team that was a top 10 team all last season, was 7th in that league, and that was the same team that almost won the ACC last season. So, but you had all that talent leave from a year ago. You had going into last season, the ACC lost 14 of their 15 all ACC teams, and they didn't really have the talent to fill in last year. You still had Louisville, who was really good, Florida State, who was a legit Final Four contender, and Duke, who was pretty good. But the rest of the league kind of fell off. Then this year, you saw Louisville fall off some, Duke fell off a bunch, and Florida State, while they're still pretty good, fell off a little bit. They're not as good as they were last year. You're just seeing a talent gap. They lost so much talent 2 years ago, and they haven't figured out how to replenish it yet. Yeah, to where you have obviously the league's going to be down when Duke and Carolina are bad, but Virginia's had some struggles. They lost to San Francisco. I think they're just finally starting to get their stuff together. I think they're the one team in the league that could be a potential Final Four team because they have Sam Hauser, they have Jay Huff, they have Kihei Clark, and they have Tony Bennett, who's a really damn good coach. But I could go on for years about the ACC. It's so weird how quickly it's fallen from grace. I think it's not going to be a permanent thing, obviously, but it's very odd just how down it's been last year and this year. But this might be the worst year the ACC's had in decades. It's so bizarre seeing the league as bad and as down as it is this season.
Very strange. One last conference to touch on, and they have been very good, especially at the top this year, the Big 12. 4 teams currently in the top 12. You already mentioned some of the top teams when talking about Baylor. I think we think the Big 10 is probably the deepest conference in college basketball, but at the top, is the Big 12 the best?
I'd say it is because they have the most teams that I would argue that could make a Final Four and potentially win a national championship. Obviously, it starts with Baylor and all the talent they have up there. We said it earlier. I think they're one of the 2 best teams in the country by a mile with Gonzaga. And then you have Texas and Shaka Smart, who have finally taken a huge lead. Shaka going from the hot seat to being a Final Four contender, just as we all predicted. But Kai Jones has been spectacular. Courtney Ramey's been really good. Greg Brown, the freshman, has been great in spots. They're extremely athletic, they're extremely long, and they're extremely tough to play against. I mean, Indiana fans saw when Texas thumped them in Asheville earlier this season, just how good that team is. And then you have West Virginia that even without Oscar Tshiebwe, who transferred to Kentucky midseason, is still really, really good. You have Texas Tech with Mac McClung, who's figured things out. If there's 3 teams from any conference, if you say take the top 3 teams from any conference, say I don't want to face one of those 3 teams in the field, you're taking the Big 12 because you obviously don't want to play Baylor, you don't want to play Texas, and you definitely don't want to play Texas Tech, Chris Beard, and that squad either. They've really seemed to figure things out after some early struggles, and they're playing some of the best basketball in the conference. Obviously, they just upset Texas in Austin last week. They played Baylor pretty tough over the weekend also. So I'd be like, yes, the Big Ten is probably the best conference. They're absolutely the deepest conference. They're going to get the most teams in of anyone in the field. But if you're talking about championship contenders, it is the Big 12 that has the most in the country.
I'm going to get in trouble here because I'm not going to ask you a question about the Big East, which is essentially, part of the Power Six, I guess.
It is.
Add them. They're having a strong season, some strong teams, but mid-major is always fun to talk about. I know we're far away from March Madness, but maybe what's 1 or 2 teams that you're looking at that come March Madness time could be the Cinderella this year?
I mean, I know we talked about him a little bit earlier. We talked about Alabama. I think Western Kentucky's a strong team. Obviously, everything they do is built around Charles Bassey. He's going to be an NBA first-round pick. They're really, really fun, really, really good. VCU out of the A-10s having a pretty good year. I know people remember them when Shaka Smart was able to make the run there. Those two teams, BYU's a solid team. They could get an at-large out of the WCC. San Diego State's good again. There's a handful. There's not like, other than obviously Gonzaga, who isn't a mid-major anymore, I'd argue, but there's not like a Dayton like there was last year or San Diego State last year to where they're going to be on the 1, 2, 3 seed lines. There's a lot of really good teams, though, that could potentially spring out some upsets.
One, you asked about the NCAA tournament. It's going to be played exclusively in Indiana at sites around Indianapolis. Very different than any NCAA tournament we've seen in the past. Expecting mostly family members, maybe a very small amount of fans allowed at games. How do you just feel that, all the neutral site locations, limited fans, not much travel, different dates and times in between games? How will that affect results of games? Are we going to see more upsets, less upsets in the tournament?
I don't know. I mean, I feel like obviously it's the right thing to do. If there's one thing we've seen throughout sports in the pandemic, is that the only way you can guarantee that you're going to get the games in is if you do some form of a bubble. I mean, that's what the NBA taught us in the NHL at the start of this thing, to where I don't know where we'll be in 6 weeks with the pandemic and the vaccines and all that stuff, but it's the right decision. It's the safe decision. It's the smart decision to play in a bubble. I think Indy's a really good place to hold that because they have the infrastructure. They have the facilities to be able to pull it off. I don't know if I'd like the new schedule for an every year thing just because I'm so used to kind of like, the Thursday, Friday first rounds and all that stuff. But I do like that the Sweet 16 will be standalone games on a Saturday instead of night games on a Thursday and Friday night. I think that could be really interesting and could be entertaining. I like I do say they were to change one thing. I'd say the second weekend setup of the Sweet 16 games over the weekend and the Elite 8 games in primetime on Monday and Tuesday. I think that could be something that sticks because you get to have every game get its own window. You're not doing the split screen thing. And that could be really entertaining, or it could be a bunch of blowouts and people could just get bored waiting for the next game. So, I mean, it could go either way. But I really do think that could be it. As far as, upsets and that stuff, I have no clue on what's going to happen on a neutral court. Obviously, a team like, Duke Carolina always take advantage of this because there always seems to be games in North Carolina, either in the regionals or in the first and second rounds, to where Duke or Carolina plays games in North Carolina and they have all of their fans there and they can make it feel like basically a road game for a team trying to pull off an upset. So maybe that goes away with a neutral site where teams are on level footing. But I think the other interesting thing is that they call it a true seed list this year, which following a strict S-curve, which they basically do every year anyway. They'll tweak a couple things for geography. I find it interesting that people made such a big deal over that because they normally do kind of follow it closely other than a few geography things, but it will be a true S-curve this year. So the top 1 seed will play the worst 2 seed, then the top 3 seed will be in that bracket and the worst 4 seed, so on and so forth. So I think that could be something interesting to follow.
All right, last question for you, Jack. I know it's hard to predict March Madness. We got about 2 more months until Final Four, but right now, give me your 4 teams in the Final Four.
Gonzaga, Baylor, Michigan, and Texas.
Okay. Do you want to leave it at that?
I mean, that won't be the Final Four because other than the 2008 Final Four, we had all 4 1 seeds in it. You just never see that much chalk. But right now, I mean, obviously, as I said, I think Gonzaga and Baylor are just a step above of everyone else. They just are. So I think it's kind of foolish to think that they're not going to make the Final Four. And then in that next group, I think kind of Michigan, Texas, and Villanova are kind of that next group. Why am I getting a million texts? I am sorry. I'm going to try to mute that real quick. But maybe. Do not disturb. Yeah, there we go. Sorry. But yeah, no, I'm sorry about that work text. But I mean, I think those 2 teams have been so consistent throughout the year, and they just bust people also, that I really like both those teams. Shaka Smart's a guy that's been to the Final Four before with VCU. Hasn't had much tournament success since then, but I think this is the best team he's had since then, obviously. also. And I like Michigan. Juwan Howard. They have guys that, while Juwan Howard hasn't done it in the NCAA tournament before, you have guys like Isaiah Livers, like Eli Brooks, that have been around for deep tournament runs in the past, and they are just so talented and so good. I feel comfortable putting them in there. I don't think that will actually be the Final Four, but that is who I would pick to be in the Final Four right now.
It makes a lot of sense. We will see a very exciting next couple months coming up in college basketball, and we know Jack will be watching all the games. We really appreciate you coming on today, Jack, and breaking everything down for us.
Anytime, Griffin. Appreciate it.
That will do it today for our Friday episode of Unpaid Interns. Thanks so much to Jack Grossman for coming on today. If you missed any of today's episode or any of our past episodes over the last couple of weeks, you can always check them out on the IU Sports Media YouTube page, or you can listen to them wherever you get your podcasts. We'll be back on Monday afternoon for our next episode of Unpaid Interns. Until then, have a great weekend. So long, everyone.